Let me start off and just say, please, you're welcome to type your question out. You're welcome to submit it in the chat. Please do not make it lecture difficile potior, the most difficult reading that is the strongest, as the doc said. But please make sure that when you submit your question that it's quite clear and to the point and to the topic. So I'll start off with a question that have been submitted, Doc, directly to me. And it pertains to the authorship, and there is a question, and they said you unfortunately could not touch upon it, but in your commentary, especially when you refer to the authorship of 2 Thessalonians, which is obviously the authorship of Paul is highly and hotly contested. In your commentary, you have a 24-page explanation of the arguments of the pro and cons. Now, we're not going to ask you to please lay out all of the arguments for the pro and cons, but can you maybe mention some of the arguments that brings you to the conclusion that is the most reasonable explanation, probably that Paul was the actual author of these books?
Yeah, thank you, Rudolph. That's a great question. I didn't get a chance to talk about it, even though it's maybe the most debated thing related to the Thessalonian epistles is the authorship of the 2 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians is not debated in terms of authorship. It's not really an issue. But 2 Thessalonians, there are a few issues going on with 2 Thessalonians. Number one is the heavy overlap between 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians in content, structure, and vocabulary and phrases. I refer to this as a copycat feature. 2 Thessalonians is just almost attention-getting in how much it copies, sometimes verbatim, from 1 Thessalonians. A second issue is what I call pseudepigraphy tells, which means the letter has features that make you suspicious of something strange going on. So, for example, Paul says in chapter 3, I write this with my own hand as a mark of authenticity in all my letters. And yet he doesn't say that explicitly in 1 Thessalonians, and he doesn't really say that explicitly in a lot of the letters, although he says something similar in a couple of other places like 1 Corinthians. But that has led scholars to be suspicious of false authorship. Now, there's a spectrum of suspicion that scholars have, and 2 Thessalonians is kind of on the dubious end, where it's a head scratcher, we're not sure, as opposed to something like Titus, where a good number of scholars say, okay, Paul didn't write this. That's a wider question we can talk about. I think people like N.T. Wright, Luke Timothy Johnson have made a clearing call for us to revisit how we talk about pseudepigraphy and how we label texts as pseudonymous. But I will say, I think sometimes the arguments we use about theological differences, 1 Thessalonians has an immediate or imminent eschatology. 2 Thessalonians has this kind of all these events has to happen. That's exaggerated because you can seem to align the two, which Nickel does in his monograph. Sometimes scholars talk about tone. 1 Thessalonians has this warm, motherly, I love you, kiss you on the head kind of tone, whereas 2 Thessalonians is like, it's going to be horrible, it's going to be war. Tone changes, and that's okay. An author can change tone from one letter to the next. So some of those issues, I think, have been exaggerated. I think probably the biggest issue is the copycat feature, which is there. And then sometimes certain terms are used. They're repeated, but they're used in a completely different way. And there's a couple of terms, and I don't remember them off the top of my head, but there are a couple of terms where that's the case. So what's going on? I think for me, a likely scenario is that Paul wants to send that second letter. He has certain things he wants to say, but the letter secretary is cribbing off of the first letter to form the letter. We know that Paul used letter secretaries. We know that in some cases, letter secretaries could take on major roles in writing the letter, as in basically writing the main parts of the letter and then leaving kind of personal features to the author. Sometimes they may have co-written the letter. Sometimes they may have written the letter entirely. One theory is that someone like Luke or possibly Timothy wrote the letter on behalf of Paul. I think those are options. What I don't think is likely is that it was written 50, 60 years later by someone completely unconnected to Paul. I think that's virtually impossible. Gordon Fee has made a strong case that that's impossible. So what you have to do if you're going to argue for pseudonymity is not only do you have to say these things don't make sense, you have to construct a scenario that's going to give rise to why a pseudepigrapher, a forger, would write these issues in Paul's name to that church. And, you know, I subscribe to the view in dubio pro reo, when in doubt, side with the accused. You know, this happens with the authorship of Colossians as well. Truth is stranger than fiction. Just because something is strange doesn't make it untrue. So the example I like to give, Rudolph, is, do you know Charlie Chaplin, the entertainer? Yeah. Charlie Chaplin entered a Charlie Chaplin lookalike contest and lost. Now, why did he lose? Either number one, the judges don't really understand what Charlie Chaplin looks like, or number two, he didn't look like his normal self. Nevertheless, someone can be themselves and lose a lookalike contest. And I think in this case, Paul has lost a lookalike contest.
I'm going to be honest with you, that was probably one of the best analogies I've heard in a long time. So thank you for that. I'll never forget it in my whole life. The next question comes from Zolani Gumede, and there is a question directly from chapter 5, verse 6 to 11. And it says, can you briefly explain 1 Thessalonians 5, 6 to 11? Why comparison of those asleep and the living?
Yeah, okay, good question. So I think in a lot of Paul's churches, he's dealing with, you know, when we're in stress, when we're in difficulty, just like we are now during the pandemic, we're not our best selves. You know, I'm an introvert. I'm spending all day with my wife and kids. It makes me grumpy, even though I love them very much. And so I'm not my best self. And so I can lash out. I can, you know, get irritable very quickly. And Paul is talking to a church going through hardship. And just like with the Philippians, just like with the Corinthians, they can turn against each other, right? When you're going through a crisis, going through a hard time, you can turn against people that you care about because you're spending time with them. You're not believing the best. I think this was going on in Thessalonica, which is why he calls for sibling love in chapter 4. And what's he doing here? He's using a military analogy, right? When he talks about armor, he talks about light. And he's basically saying being people of the day, being people of the light is about being a good soldier that carries on towards the mission without being selfish, without going to those darker places. I would say to some degree he's fitting this in the First Thessalonians. To some degree, this is advice he gives in other letters. He gives us similar advice in Romans, I think, chapter 13. Talking about people of the day, people of the light, people who put on Christ, people who put on this armor. I think he's pulling from military images because soldiers were known to be people who were resilient, people who deferred to a higher authority, people who were known to have self-discipline. And I think he does that in several of his letters as a way of saying, okay, all the stuff is going on around you, like the fog of war. And what does a good soldier do? They keep their eyes focused on the mission. They keep their eyes focused on the sovereign. They keep their eyes focused on the general. And to live as people of the day and the light mean that you see around you to what's really going on, that Satan is trying to deceive you, or that evil is trying to trap you in sin. And, you know, this fits into his conversation about purity. Soldiers at that time were not allowed to get married. That doesn't mean they didn't fool around. They probably did. But the greater idea is they had to be singularly focused on the mission. And I think Paul is drawing off of similar images to say, I use the Briticism, keep calm and carry on. I think that's what he's doing.
Oh, absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Doc. Well, the next question comes from Cornelia van Deventer, and she writes the following. She says, the greeting of 1 Thessalonians begin with 3 correlating nomatives. Obviously, Paulos, Solanos, and Timotheus. Sorry for my Greek announcement of that. Could you say something about the implications of this triad for authorship and message?
Okay. Yeah, that is a great question. It's a very perceptive question, and it's a question that, number one, scholars talk about, and number two, have no idea. I'll say a couple of things. Number one view is that the senders were collaborators in the letter. The problem with that view is, number one, many of Paul's letters show a kind of coherence that seems like singular authorship. And sometimes it seems like you start out with these co-senders, but then they kind of fade out of view in terms of Paul's use of I or talking about himself. Now, in 1 Thessalonians, he does talk about we as the apostles, but I'm unsure whether they actually were sitting there forming the letter. I wonder if it's more this idea that they were part of his team. They send their greetings. Now, having said that, I mentioned Luke Timothy Johnson a couple times. He wrote a really good book called Constructing Paul. I encourage all of you to read it because it's absolutely fascinating. And basically, Johnson argues Paul had different writing teams. Sometimes he used this team, sometimes he used this team, and sometimes he used this team. And when he's working with these different teams, which could include apostolic collaborators and letter secretaries, then you're going to get a little bit of different writing flavor in terms of the writing style. And so Johnson says, instead of looking at it in terms of pseudonymity or whatever, look at it in terms of writing teams. And then so you have like a Corinthian writing team, you have a pastoral epistles writing team, you have a Romans and Galatians writing team or something like that. This is the first time I've heard it expressed that way. The book just came out last year, I think. But I found it exceptionally convincing. He's coming out with a second volume, which is going to get more into the details in a few months. And I think it's Interpreting Paul, Luke Timothy Johnson. I'm eager to see what he says. I think he's right. He made a kind of theoretical case for this. I think now he's going to make a practical case for it, and that I agree with. So, Cornelia, I didn't actually answer your question because I think it's too hard to answer. For sure, he's doing it rhetorically to say, this is my team. They send their greetings. They're with me in spirit. Whether they actually help to shape or write the letter, I'm too hesitant to say yes. But I'm interested to see what Johnson has to say in the next few months to see if he convinces me that the answer is yes. I'm open to persuasion. Let's put it that way.
That is good to know. Another question from Jose de Carvalho. He says the following: Thank you, Dr. Gupta. The pronoun we in chapter 4, verse 15, has led some to proclaim that Paul thought Jesus would come back in his generation. And then hyphens, just Paul uses we other times in the letter that way. I think that this is unlikely, but would appreciate your thoughts. Any comments on chapter 4:15?
It's really hard to say what Paul thought exactly about human history. Could Paul imagine that Christianity would still be going on, a couple thousand years later? I don't think so. I think he thought he was in that time where things are going to happen rapidly. We do know over the first century that Christians decided, yes, we must write these things down. Yes, we must get the Jesus story in written form. Paul is very concerned with circulating his letters. The idea of a circulation and collection began to happen pretty early on because we learned that from 2 Peter. At the same time, his message in 1 Thessalonians is not so much it's going to happen today or tomorrow, as much as it'll happen unpredictably. So I think Paul assumed it was going to happen, almost assumed it was going to happen in his lifetime. But I don't know what to say about the we language. I think he wanted, if you look at a text like Romans 15, he saw an urgency in preparing the Gentile church to be a holy offering to the Lord. And in 1 Thessalonians, he talks about, I must ensure that you're sanctified. 2 Thessalonians, I must ensure that you're sanctified. He felt a burden on him to make sure these churches got serious about the business of being pure and holy immediately. In terms of, I don't know if you're implying this in the question, but did he shift his thinking later on? I don't think he ever shifted his thinking. I think he did think, if it's going to happen later rather than sooner, we need to make sure the leadership chain is there. We need to make sure material gets transmitted to the next generation. So I guess to me, there's not enough information to know exactly what was in his head. I do think that he assumed this could happen at any time, as he says in Philippians, whether we live or die. He does that in 1 Corinthians, whether we live or die. But then in Philippians, he also says, I would like to press on and continue the ministry. He doesn't say to the Philippians, life is going to end really soon no matter what, so let's just give up. He's, and actually in 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians, he's very concerned about staying the course. So I think imminent would still be the right word, but along with unpredictable.
I think that's wonderful. Dr. Gupta, just another question. I hope you don't mind if we bombard you with this, but this might show a little bit as to what you believe about biblical eschatology, especially when it comes to the book of Thessalonians. The question is directed and it's asked, if you maybe want to comment between what the difference is between the rapture and the second coming. Is there a difference? Is it a similar event? And that is a question from Muketsi Ntilo.
That's a great question because it comes up a lot, and there are a lot of assumptions that churches make about the rapture. The first thing to know is that the rapture doctrine, as we have it in its kind of detailed form, is a pretty new phenomenon in church history. It's only been around for a couple hundred years. The early church, the patristic writers, don't give us a clear sense that they believed in kind of a snatching up away of people from the earth, and then the people on, the unbelievers on earth remaining there for a period of time. So this idea of this timeline, the terminology does come from 1 Thessalonians because he talks about being snatched away. But the concepts really are grounded in Matthew and Revelation. So I believe it really comes down to a particular hermeneutic of the book of Revelation. And with some pieces of like Matthew and Mark and Luke in there as well. This is a kind of philosophy of eschatology that will differentiate different scholars. My philosophy of eschatology is neither Jesus, nor Paul, nor John the Seer cared that much that we know exactly what happens in the future. In fact, it's almost counter-purpose to what God wants, for us to know too much. The reason is we begin trusting a timeline rather than trusting God. And I think what Revelation wants to communicate, what Paul wants to communicate, what Jesus wants to communicate is, number one, things are going to get bad for believers. And we have to know that, and we have to count the cost, basically. Paul basically says that as well. Number two, we need to always be faithful. This is, I think, why Paul talks about this is the will of God. And they're waiting. Okay, he's going to tell us now. He says, be holy. He's like, this is the will of God. They're waiting now. Tell me. He says, be thankful in all things. I think when the New Testament teaches on eschatology, it's essentially teaching on a theology of hope. This is why Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, comfort one another with these words, we will always be with the Lord. To me, any sermon series on eschatology should come back around at every sermon to that main point. I don't know if you're familiar with the preacher Jonathan Edwards, but he's famous for this booklet, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Now, I studied Jonathan Edwards in seminary, and often that sermon is misunderstood because people don't read the sermon, they just hear the title. His point isn't that God is wrathful. His point is the sinners are still in the hands of an angry God. So it's not they've been thrown in the hell of an angry God. They're still in the hands of an angry God. And that point often gets missed in eschatology. If I were to teach a course in Revelation, I would probably not teach on all the ghosts and goblins and things that go bump in the night. I would focus on God's victory over sin and death and how Christians participate in that through love, faithfulness, and Christian witness. Now, if you want to read a really good book on Book of Revelation, I encourage you to read Michael Gorman's introduction called Reading Revelation Responsibly. He does talk about the rapture doctrine in there. He does debunk the rapture doctrine. There's another really good book by Barbara Rossing called Rapture Exposed, where she points out how the development of the rapture doctrine and how the early church really didn't have a sophisticated eschatology that resembles the rapture doctrine as developed by Darby and then later by the Scofield Bible.
That is excellent. We offer counseling sessions afterwards for everybody or anyone that has now got their eschatology wrecked, especially the Left Behind series. A wonderful question posted in here by Dr. Batinyai, and he says the following. First one, there's actually two. He says, thank you so much for your presentation. Could you comment on Doug Campbell's reconstruction of the Pauline timeline, apart from Acts, and how it influences your reading of 1 Thessalonians?
Yeah. Okay. This is one of those questions I was dreading, Bat, because I don't think that I put much stock in crafting a perfect timeline for Paul's letters in the way that many other scholars confidently do. The tent pegs, the historical tent pegs that we have for the timeline of Paul's letters come from the Book of Acts and come from a few clues in Paul's letters, like the reference to the Claudian expulsion of Priscilla and Aquila, and a few figures. I think Erastus, I think is one of the pieces. I think those give us some rough outlines. So Bat's talking about a relatively new book by Doug Campbell called Reframing Paul, and Doug just moves all the pieces on the board to different places. He's actually good at shaking things up, asking the right questions. Do I think that his historical reconstruction is better than other historical reconstructions? No. Do I think it's terrible? No. But I think, from my understanding, what Doug does is he basically tries to create a timeline without using Acts. And I think that's against conventional wisdom. That treats Acts, I think, too harshly. I think we have to take into account Luke's literary purposes, theological purposes, but I feel like we're disabling our ability to really fit Paul into a timeline if we take Acts out of the equation. And so I wouldn't subscribe to Doug's stuff. What I would say is he offers a good opportunity to revisit a lot of assumptions we have. I do like that he plays around with some of our questions about pseudepigraphy, and he's willing to accept, I think, the Pauline authorship of several letters because of his kind of looking at the pieces over again. What I love about Doug's work, and I encourage you to read his work, is he does shatter some of our things that we've just assumed and haven't really studied. And he's one of those people that forces you to go back to the text and say, okay, is that information really there, or is that an interpretation? And so far as that's concerned, I think his work is really helpful.
Thank you so much. And then Dr. Bat gave another wonderful question, and he says, Richard Askoch seems to drive his explication of communities via rigid categorizations drawn from the first century groupings. Is there any evidence of hybridity of the different first century groupings in 1 Thessalonians? If so, what does it tell us about their social identity?
That is a very sophisticated question. Thank you. Okay. We are disadvantaged in 1 Thessalonians in many ways because of the lack of names of Thessalonians. And so, for example, in Philippians, which I've been working on a lot lately, we have lots of named people like Euodia and Syntyche and Clement, and that starts to give us profiles to construct these people. In 1 Thessalonians, we have precious little tangible information. I'll say the only really constructive information we have is Paul's two things. One is his emphasis on manual labor. So this isn't going to apply to excessively wealthy, high status people because they don't work with their hands. I mean, they are elites and they, go on vacation a lot and they're patrons and they have big houses and they have slaves. So they're not going to do manual labor. So it's unlikely that the majority would be elites, because Paul is giving it as an assumption that the majority of the church is at the artisan level. They're not necessarily hand to mouth, but because most people were living kind of paycheck to paycheck, these were kind of lower middle class, lower class people, our assumption. The second piece of information is the fact that there isn't a lot of Jewish-oriented material in the letter. Like I mentioned, use the Old Testament. So we get the sense there were a lot of non-Jews in the group. And so that's, that is helpful. Another piece of information is First Thessalonians chapter 1, where he says they turned from idols to serve the living and the true God. This assumption that Paul would never refer to Jewish worship as idolatry. So they come from pagan backgrounds. Now, having said that, I wrote an article actually for Neo-Testamentica on whether that discounts God-fearers, Gentiles who had some connection to the Jewish synagogue. I don't think it does. I think many ancient God-fearers were Gentiles who worshipped their own ancestral deities and worshipped the God of Israel. And so that helps us construct some information in terms of, were they involved in voluntary associations? Were they involved in the synagogue? Were they involved in civil posts? We just don't know. We don't have enough information. We have tons of information from Romans. We have tons of information from 1 Corinthians, but we have precious little information from 1 Thessalonians.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Doc. Another question from Dylan Thomas, Dylan Matthews, sorry. He asks the following question. He says, why would Paul specifically mention quenching the spirit in his letter? I think that is in chapter 5:19. Is there any specific reason for this regarding the Thessalonian church?
Yeah, good question. And just from that verse itself, we don't know. But I shared my theory, which I'll mention again. My theory is some people in the church died, and the natural instinct of a Greek heritage, Macedonian heritage, Thessalonican, is to go to an oracle, is to wonder, did I incur the wrath of the gods? Because maybe some neighbors were saying, hey, you're not worshiping our local deities. That's going to spell trouble. So, for example, there was the city in the ancient world where the city of Tyre, Tyre, and there was a raiding military from another nation. And the people of the city were worried that the god Apollos was going to abandon their city. So they tied his statue down with gold chains so he wouldn't fly away. And this is the kind of mentality that people have, that if you get on the wrong side of the gods, they're going to abandon you and they're going to bear the wrath upon you. So what I think is happening is that some people were wanting to visit an oracle or to access some prophecy in order to see if they've offended the gods. And then there may have been a backlash reaction where some believers were saying, no, they were discounting prophecy altogether. And that could be seen as quenching the spirit. And Paul's saying, no, Paul wouldn't want them to go to an oracle, but he would want to say, test the spirits, see what's good, retain that. So don't quench the spirit, don't reject prophecy, but just test it and see if it fits with the gospel. That's my theory.
Absolutely brilliant. Another question just through the margins. Does Paul actually know that he is writing scriptures while he's writing to the Thessalonians?
Good question. I actually have about 3 or 4 minutes left, and then I need to go. But I'll say something about this. So I think the answer is no. The fact that these are letters are really important. I actually thought about this question as I was getting ready this morning. An example that comes to mind is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison. Bonhoeffer was in prison for a couple of years, and he wrote lots of letters, especially to his fiancée and to his best friend, Eberhard Bethke. He writes very personal things in there. He writes very kind of Dear Diary kinds of things, very intimate, personal things. He could have never known it would be packaged by Fortress Press and sent out to thousands upon thousands of people to read in seminaries and in divinity schools and graduate colleges. And I don't know how he would feel about it he says some very dark things in there. He says, talking about as if God never existed, and there's questions about that. He talks about how much he hates reading the New Testament because it's too hope-filled. He'd rather read the Old Testament because it's more gritty and real. So Bonhoeffer never would guess that his prison letters would be, publicized. And we benefit from them, and they're brilliant. They're theologically brilliant. I think the same way with Paul. I think, did he think he was inspired? I'm not sure. But the fact that he wrote in letters is really extraordinary. Scholars like Gene Boring talk about this as a media innovation. This was the first time in history that deeper philosophy, or what we call theology, would be taught in a very personal, non-academic form of writing. And I do assume he thought his letters would be taken with apostolic authority. But in terms of this, becoming something that people read for hundreds of years or thousands of years, or being treated as on par with the Old Testament, I don't think that was in his mind. He's in this movement that is happening very fast. And he's speaking as a leader, and he's writing as a leader. And I think that he expected his material to be taken seriously. But think about it this way. If he believed he had scriptural authority, he could just say, do this, don't do that. He doesn't have to write 16 chapters of something. The fact his letters are so long means that he wants to convince his readers with rhetorical, theological arguments. And so if he just had Pope-like powers of just telling people what to do, he wouldn't write such long letters as he does sometimes. So I think that he affirmed his own apostolic authority on many occasions, including in 1 Thessalonians. But he really speaks to them as a Christian leader wanting to form them as Jesus communities.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, Dr. Nijay, I think we have come to a close, and I think you've taken quite a lot of questions. Thank you so much for doing so. Maybe in future we can get you back on eschatology or even 2 Thessalonians. That would be wonderful. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for spending time with all of us here. Be blessed. Thank you, Doc, and speak with you again.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.